Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello friends and 18Es, I hope that you've been well. In today's video, I am going to be taking you through the entire process of how I painted a stylized realism portrait using mixed media. I'll show you how I pick the best reference photos, the planning/sketching phase, how I combine watercolors, gouache, color pencils, and paint markers to create a portrait that still captures a real person's likeness. As you can see, I painted all 8 members of the K-pop group ATEEZ, which was quite the task, but also very rewarding to see them all together, and truly was powered by my love of this group, and the passion of a fangirl really came through here. And for those of you who follow me on Instagram or are a patron of mine, you'll probably have already seen these since I actually did them early last year, and I've been selling them as postcard prints on my online shop and at conventions, which are still available if you're interested. For my own sanity, I didn't film the entire process of every single member, so for the focus of today's video, we are only going to be going through the process of one member, which is going to be Sunghwa. First order of business is looking for some reference photos, and in my case, deciding which era of Sunghwa to pick from, because as you can see, this diva has many different iconic hairstyles and outfits. In the case of any good reference photo for the purpose of the art style we're going for, you want to avoid photos where the image is overexposed or doesn't have a distinguishable light source. For example, these photos, the lighting is bright and it's hard to see the definitive shadows to define his facial features, whereas the photo you can see here, immediately you can tell which direction the light source is coming from, and there's a much clearer definition of shadows and highlights. I had asked on Instagram what hair people wanted to see for Sunghwa, and a lot of people had voted for his pink hair, which I absolutely love, but I was also torn because I really loved this stage look and outfit from the North American tour, so I thought why not use my artistic power that I wield to combine the two looks together. I also ended up choosing a third photo as the face reference because I felt like I really wanted to hit that criteria that I was talking about earlier about having a very clear light source that defined his features. Now it's time to actually draw him. So I start by using Procreate on my iPad. I like to do this stage digitally because it really is helpful to be able to resize and move features around to get that likeness without having to redraw everything over and over if it's in the wrong spot, because those little shifts in where the features go and how big they are on the face really make a difference. And it's been almost a year since I've made this, and it's so interesting looking back at this because I totally forgot that even during the sketching phase, I actually did debate on giving him that longer black hair, which you can see I actually did draw in, and I go back and forth between the two hairstyles, which, as we have discussed, I do end up going with the pink hair in the end. But I also really like to include some of the shading in this stage as well when it comes to these more realistic portraits, because I do find that the shading is also part of what helps get that likeness on a real person, because it's hard to fully see it when it's just lines. And so I like to do that in this stage as well to make sure that the drawing holds up in getting that likeness of the person. And I also map out the color scheme just roughly as well, because it's just good to know for when I start to actually paint. And also I wanted to make sure that every member had their own color scheme. And then when I've settled on that, I actually bring this into Photoshop to do the text. So I wanted to do the text similar to the Outlaw album cover series to, have that reference. And after I pick the font, I adjust the spacing to get it to fit the border. And then I turn it into just black outlines so that when I transfer this sketch onto watercolor paper, it's just easy for me. And then I end up rasterizing the text layer so that I can manipulate it, and that way I can skew the letters to give it that perspective effect that is the same on the album cover design. And then I repeat that on the other side and I include his last name since it is a longer stretch there. Then when I am finished with the sketch, I print it out onto copy paper, and then using my light pad, I transfer/trace the sketch onto my watercolor paper. But before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. So something that I really appreciate about Squarespace is that the Instagram plugin feature automatically updates on my website without me having to actually manually do it. That way, even if my main gallery hasn't been updated in a while, I like knowing that at least there's a section on my website that will always be showing my most recent work. And I also love how intuitive the design features are and that everything updates live as you're making the adjustments. And while I do find that the overall platform is very easy to use, there are great tools and posts readily available to help you out every step of the way. So if you're interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Starting out with watercolors, I use a wide flat paintbrush to wet the paper with just clean water. And then I add in a light wash for the base colors for the skin, hair, clothes, and the background. And the reason why I like to wet the entire paper first is I find that it helps these washes just look a little smoother and gets rid of any like super visible paintbrush strokes. And then I decided to start rendering the big shadow shapes, first using shades of magenta and peach. I felt like since his hair is going to be pink, I might as well use the same shades in his skin as well. And I find that it just helps everything feel a little bit more cohesive. Plus, I think that this is sort of one of the ways of making the portrait feel more stylized is when you exaggerate the colors. And in my case, for me, it's making them more saturated since I am a big lover of color. And while having a solid sketch is really important, you also have to be really mindful when you're painting as well, when you're rendering the shadows and the highlights to really sell the likeness of the person you're painting. So I'm constantly referring back to the reference photo that I have of Seonghwa to really understand how to render his features and get the different planes of his face. When you're trying to draw/paint a portrait that resembles a real person, you really got to pay attention to what stands out to you when you look at them. Like, what is it about their features that make them them? And for me, when I look at Seonghwa, he really has high cheekbones. And then I find that he has a very tall nose and very full lips. I would say that his top lip being a little bit fuller than his bottom lip. And he has like pretty strong eyebrows as well, like very like sharp eyebrows. And this is also something to keep in mind when you're painting a real person is I find that it's really good to have multiple reference photos or to really analyze multiple different photos of somebody, because sometimes certain photos are not like the best representation of what that person looks like or like their standout features. And when you cross-reference multiple different photos of somebody, it really helps you pinpoint those things that really stand out to you. And that's why for me, I find it really important when you're picking that reference photo that you're using as the main kind of reference point is those clear shadows and highlights when you're picking that photo. So having the light source be very obvious, and I find that just makes rendering the features much more straightforward as opposed to those photos that are like really blown out where the shadows are not as defined or obvious when it comes to the facial features. Of course, this is dependent on the type of stylization that you're going for. For me, these AT's portraits ended up being a little bit leaning, you know, more realistic. So that's why picking that reference photo with the clear light source was really important. I find watercolor tends to dry lighter and duller compared to when it's wet. So if you're like me and you really want those bright colors, try not to mix too many colors in one go. I find that the color payoff tends to look more saturated the fewer pigments you use in one mixture. So for example, I think that a lot of the instances where I'm painting with a pink shade, it's likely just from one magenta tubed paint. So I think I used quinacridone magenta in this case, and I basically just dilute it directly with water. And if you ever find that you went too bright in an area, you can always just use a watered down layer of another color to make it less saturated. But I find that for me, I want that like really bright payoff. And again, it's just part of my style is going for those really saturated colors. For these ATEEZ portraits, I was using hot press paper, which is very smooth. And the thing about using hot press paper with watercolor is you don't get the best gradients or like smooth color washes of watercolors. You can see like the area under his jaw especially, it's like kind of patchy looking, and I definitely don't want that for the final result. But the reason why I decided to use hot press paper for these portraits is because I wanted to be able to use color pencils with them. And I find that with hot press paper, because there isn't any texture, you're able to get much smoother applications with color pencils, and of course get in really detailed areas because you're not fighting with like a textured surface. And for these portraits, I wanted them to have all of those little details because I wanted them to lean a little bit more realistic. And also I find that using colored pencils, I have a lot more control with them. They're not unpredictable in the way that watercolors are. Another color choice that I made for this portrait was introducing some cool colors, particularly light blues and purples in some of the shadows on the left side of the face. I used both color pencils and washes of watercolors, and it does help desaturate some of the areas that I thought needed it, but it also creates, point of interest to give some variation in the colors there. Plus, I knew that the background was going to contain a lot of purples, so I feel like it helps make the subject feel connected to the background as well. And when it came to painting the background, I had 2 different color mixtures ready on the palette so that I could alternate between the 2 colors really quickly. I did one first wash of just the purple, and then the second one after it had dried, I went in with a purple and like a dark indigo. And you want to lay down the paint while it's still wet so that they kind of bleed into each other for a more seamless kind of color payoff. It's definitely not perfect since, like I mentioned earlier, it's harder to achieve smooth gradients with hot press paper. So it is something that I did multiple layers of, and that is just sort of something you kind of have to accept with hot press paper. It's a little harder to just get those really nice smooth gradients, but I wasn't overly concerned about it being imperfect because I was going to have that text border around him anyways. And like I did with the portrait on the face there, I'm also adding in that purple onto the clothes as well to get everything to feel like they're connected and have a similar lighting. And I really liked adding the purple to the brown of his outfit because, again, it just creates that harmonious color story and just creates a little bit of interest. And a thing that I had decided to do for this was, in the original outfit, he has like a brooch that's like a flower, I think, but I've replaced it with the ATEEZ logo because why not? It feels, you know, more relevant, and I think it's like a fun extra touch. You know, we have those artistic liberties to do that. And even though he's wearing like light greenish contacts when he's got the pink hair in the photo that I'm using as the reference, I do make sure to add in kind of some browns to create the depth in the eyes, because the green, you want it to feel subtle and more natural looking. I feel like if I were to have rendered the eyes just in all shades of green, it would look a little too unnatural and not feel harmonious with the rest of the portrait. And I make sure to continue to add in all those little details, especially around the eyes and the facial features, because I don't want to lose any of those original kind of sketch lines that I had done at the beginning, because they're really important to maintain as we continue working on this to keep that likeness and resemblance to him. But I was finding that I needed to really pump up the contrast and color, so now I'm introducing acrylic gouache into the mix. One of the things that I absolutely love about acrylic gouache is that the color remains much closer from when it's wet to when it's dry, so it's more predictable in that sense. And I'm also able to create really dark darks and really vibrant shades, which is definitely what I was hoping to achieve with these portraits, just those really bright colors, very saturated. And you can see I'm using sort of a mixture of like kind of purpley burgundies and magentas for those shadow areas. And I'm using a lot of water in these acrylic gouache mixes so that I'm able to still see what I'd done underneath, and you're getting a mix of that smooth texture from the acrylic gouache, but then you're still seeing bits of that grit from the colored pencil peeking through. I absolutely loved adding that like neon fluorescent pink sort of in those transition shades areas, kind of where the shadow starts to shift into the highlight. It just creates like a really fun and satisfying look, kind of cyberpunky. I don't know how to describe it. I just really like doing that. And of course, a huge benefit to using acrylic gouache is it's an opaque medium, so I'm actually able to lighten certain areas that I thought I went too dark in. This is something that is much more difficult to achieve with watercolors. And also, I find that I don't get the same amount of color saturation payoff with watercolors and colored pencils. You can see the eyeshadow there, the color is just so much more vibrant using acrylic gouache, and same with the lips. And I'm able to just achieve really punchy colors. And some of you might be wondering, why not just use acrylic gouache then? Why go through the trouble of doing the watercolors and the color pencils if I'm going to go over certain areas with acrylic gouache? But for me, I find that having all of these different textures mixed together just creates a really interesting looking illustration. So you can see here I'm using color pencils again to do the kind of strands of the hair. One, I find this is so much faster to do with a color pencil than it is with a paintbrush, but also I find that sometimes when I use only acrylic gouache, it's so smooth that it looks digital, and sometimes that's a look that I want to go for, like something super smooth. But I've been really wanting to make sure that my work looks traditional. There's just something so tactile about it, and so that's why I like using the mix of the watercolor and the color pencils with the acrylic gouache. And I make sure that the acrylic gouache isn't covering everything. I'm just using it in certain areas to enhance the depth of something or to pump up that saturation. And I'm going on the background again because I wanted it to have more depth. And that is the thing with watercolors, is usually that first pass, especially if you're using a lot of water, looks pretty desaturated, but the more layers you add, it does get a lot brighter. And then time for the lettering. I did a number of troubleshooting with the first portrait, which was Hongjun. So by the time I got to the Songhwa one, I already knew that the acrylic paint markers was going to be the best bet, not only for precision, but also opacity. I did use a color pencil to outline the text again, just because it definitely gets lost when I do all those layers of color pencils. And I switch between two different shades of pink here just to give that sort of not watercolor, but the gradient effect that I'm doing with the background, but carrying it into the text as well. I think when I did the Hongjun portrait, which was the first one, I had started with using acrylic gouache for the letters, but using a paintbrush I just don't get the same precision, and it felt like it was just going to take so much longer. And yeah, these acrylic paint markers are so opaque, and I have so much more control with getting those like really straight lines. Of course, the line work is not perfect, but as good as it's going to get. And using the color pencils here to add in some more details like the grommets on the lacing here. I find that even with a really sharp black color pencil, I'm still not able to get the full darkest depths that I want. And so I use a very precise paintbrush, a 3/0, to use with acrylic gouache to really get those finer details on areas that I think are the most important. So the facial features, and just really defining those areas so that they really stand out and are really, really sharp. When I'm working on these fine details in line art, I always have my hand resting right against the surface of the paper so that I can have a steady hand. But sometimes this ends up turning into me smudging wet paint, and this actually happens more often than you might think. But in this case, it ended up being a pretty dire spot because I swipe my hand across his nostril there that created a really dark smudge. But thankfully I worked really quickly, and basically what I did was used a clean wet paintbrush to sort of buff out the paint that had been smudged and sort of lift it away. And then I color matched the base skin tone there with acrylic gouache to clean up and cover up the paint that had been smudged. And I'm so impressed with how well I was able to fix that mistake. And this is a testament to the layers of color pencil and acrylic gouache that were able to like maintain that base when I did that, scrub of water to like wipe away the paint. So yeah, that was a fun thing that I caught on camera, and I'm glad I was able to show you guys and tell you how I fixed it. And then after that area is mostly dry, I go back in and draw that nostril back in. I did make a little bit of a mistake there again, I think, but it ended up getting fixed in the end. And yeah, I find adding in that kind of shadow in the irises really help make the eyes come alive, of course, and also adding in those bright highlights with the white paint marker. But yeah, we're kind of nearing the end here of the process of this portrait. I hope that you learned something or found it insightful. I do actually have a series of videos that I did over on my Patreon page where I did a video breaking down how I draw different facial features and trying to capture likeness on people, like a more detailed kind of breakdown. And then I also did a demo portrait painting using acrylic paints, acrylic gouache, and then regular gouache, and then just kind of compared them. I did them all like on one page, and they were of like notable celebrities so that you could see how I went about capturing their likeness. And yeah, my Patreon page, if you're interested in exclusive videos, you can join just the $5 tier and have access to the full catalog, which is over 50 videos. Of course, you don't have to join my Patreon page if you don't want to, or you just can't. I have plenty of free content here on YouTube. I actually have them broken up into different playlists so that you can look for the certain type of medium in a much clearer way. So I have the watercolor and ink playlist. I have one for gouache. I have one for sketchbooks. And if you happen to be interested in picking up these 80s portraits, I do have postcard prints of them available in my online shop, which is going to be linked in the description. And you can check out all the other stuff that I have on there as well. My shop does not exclusively have K-pop related things. But yeah, I really appreciate you watching all the way to the end. I am so grateful to everyone who likes and comments on my videos. It really helps out the channel if you can't, support me by my Patreon or my shop. And for those of you who are 18s/80s fans, please let me know in the comments who your bias is and what your favorite current song is. I would love to discuss 80s with you. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!